before. Arden, you seem to try to make the case that whatever kind of national data there was appropriate to California. The California data was rich and strong and kind of fit with the national. I guess I come away with a more general view that says the signals that we're seeing in terms of when we look at the national data, clearly there seems to be things that are very different in the industrial Midwest and the Northeast, and that causes me to I accept the notion that there's some things that are happening there. I'm not certain how much we should ascribe to PM2.5 or the sulfate or any individual pollutant. I tend to look at it as saying there's a very clear air pollution effect in those areas. Now I come out to California, and in my understanding, we've got a considerably different situation with regard to the kind of mix of air pollutants we have out here. Doesn't that cause you to be, why aren't you a little bit more cautious in terms of taking an extrapolation from that national data out to California? I certainly think we should be rather cautious.
Well, it's a pretty loaded question, frankly. I wasn't making an argument about how cautious you should be. I was making the argument that the human lungs, the human cardiovascular system, humans in California are similar to those elsewhere. I mean, there's no evidence in the overall data that
a few attributes.
We all agree on that. Yeah, and so I made that point. The other point I made is that the sources of pollution, while somewhat different, they used to be a lot more different back when there were more steel mills and more coal-fired power plants. Admittedly, you don't have nearly as much sulfate here, but the traffic-related pollutants, the constituencies are basically the same throughout the United States. They're coming from the same fuel, they're coming from the same automobiles, the same trucks. And furthermore, if you actually were to do sort of an overall empirical, the overall empirical evidence, as I see it, suggests that in California what you have is a small. Now, again, I'm perfectly willing to accept the understanding or accept the argument that the pollution effects are smaller than many other risk factors. I mean, there are other risk factors bigger. But because we're focused on pollution right now, the small, relatively coherent effects of higher cardiopulmonary, cardiovascular effects of air pollution, and that general pattern exists in California just like they exist in Utah, just like they exist in the Ohio River Valley. And I've admitted right up front that I don't know which specific constituents of these pollutants are causing the primary effect, or if it's a combination of the group. Right now it actually seems to be more a combination, frankly. But if you go to Sao Paulo and do time series study in Sao Paulo, you get similar results as you get in LA, as you get in Steubenville. And it's my judgment, not an issue of being cautious, it's just my judgment that the studies that are being conducted elsewhere, in the United States particularly, but probably most of them in Western Europe and some of them even in other parts of the world, those studies are relevant to understanding what's going on in terms of the health effects in California, just like they are in Chongqing, China, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
I think you really wandered off wide. I mean, you spent time in China. I spent time there. Anybody who wants to talk about air pollution in China as having a high degree of relevance to the U.S. or California, I say, come on, let's focus on the USA. And I'm not as sanguine as you are in terms of saying, well, let's take the Midwest and upper Northeast and relate it out here.
So I
looked at those things you showed on the air pollution there in terms of Mort Lipman and Son. Lipman's made a pretty strong argument for nickel coming down out of Canada as being part of that.
So I want to draw the atmospheric scientists on the sitting around the table into the discussion, and just this question of what we might know about the air mixture sources in California, and are there reasons? So putting aside, sort of whether, because I think that you're asking a very tough question if you want to say, can we estimate epidemiologically whether risks are different in California from the nation as a whole or from other parts? That's a real tough question, but there's an awful lot of atmospheric measurements have been made in California. There's huge amounts of atmospheric science done. So what about those data and how they might help us?
The issue talking about the correlation between sulfur and sulfur dioxide and PM this morning, but it not only the SO2 is a continuous gases monitoring, so it has a much longer history, so it has better data and longer data, and that's no doubt. But also, when you do this kind of analysis, it's always a match of a population-based data to the concentration data on the same basis, the geographical areas. And particulars tend to vary a lot from place to place. And SO2 is more homogeneous mixed. So that I would suggest that might be a reason SO2 could come out, have a much stronger relationship simply because that. I think you're right. I mean, there are two pieces. One is the concentration. One is the health data. It's always difficult to really think about the actually talking about the same areas. That concept has to implant it. And a lot of the information that this morning presented, so east-west, you really have to look at, how you correlate those data. So I think that is probably the main reason cause of variation in the different studies, I would suggest. And nowadays, in Southern California or in California in general, most of the risks we're talking about is really related to transportation and mobile source type of emissions, which is pretty generic urbanized areas.
Yes, sir.